The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence's house as Charles walked slowly along the gravel path, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose the public knew so well. But today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite place why. The autumn air carried a crispness that reminded him of his childhood at Balmoral, yet there was an underlying tension that seemed to follow him everywhere these days. He had always been a man of routine, finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of royal life. Morning tea at precisely 7, newspapers arranged in order of importance, correspondence reviewed before 9. But, lately, even these familiar rituals felt hollow, as if he was moving through his days without truly being present. Perhaps it was the weight of recent events, or maybe it was something else entirely. Charles paused near the rose garden, remembering how Camilla had spent hours here just last week, carefully tending to the late-blooming varieties. She had seemed distracted then, he realized now, her usual animated chatter replaced by an almost contemplative silence. At the time, he had attributed it to the changing season, the natural melancholy that seemed to affect everyone as summer faded into autumn. The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see his private secretary approaching with the morning's correspondence, a thick stack of cream-colored envelopes, and official documents that would demand his attention for the next several hours. But, as he reached for the papers, something else caught his eye. A small, unmarked envelope that had somehow become mixed in with the official mail. The envelope was unremarkable in every way, plain white with no return address, his name written in what appeared to be Camilla's distinctive handwriting. But something about it seemed odd. The paper felt different somehow, thicker than her usual stationery, and the ink appeared to be from an unfamiliar pen. Charles dismissed these observations as the product of an overactive imagination and slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, intending to read it later when he had more privacy. The rest of the morning passed in its usual blur of meetings and administrative duties. Charles found himself going through the motions, his mind repeatedly drifting to the mysterious envelope in his pocket. During a particularly tedious briefing about agricultural policy, he caught himself absently touching the spot where the letter rested, wondering what could be so important that Camilla would choose to write rather than speak to him directly. It wasn't until after lunch that he finally found a moment alone in his study. The room was quiet except for the gentle ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece, a gift from his grandmother many years ago. Charles settled into his favorite leather chair, the one that had been his father's before him, and carefully opened the envelope. The letter was brief, written on paper he didn't recognize. Camilla's handwriting was unmistakable, but there was something hurried about it, as if she had been writing under some kind of pressure. The message itself was cryptic, mentioning a meeting at a location he didn't recognize, a small tea shop in a part of London he rarely visited. She asked him not to mention the letter to anyone, including his staff, and signed it simply with her initial. Charles read the letter 3 times, trying to understand its meaning. Camilla had never been secretive with him before, at least not that he could remember. Their relationship had always been built on openness and trust, even during the most difficult periods. This sudden shift to clandestine meetings and signed letters was completely out of character. He considered calling her directly, but something in the tone of the letter suggested that would be a mistake. Instead, he spent the rest of the afternoon trying to concentrate on his official duties while his mind wandered to possible explanations. Perhaps she was planning some kind of surprise, though his birthday was still months away. Or maybe she had received news of some kind that she didn't want to share over the phone. As evening approached, Charles made his decision. He would go to the meeting, partly out of curiosity, but mostly out of concern for Camilla. If she felt the need to communicate in this way, there must be something seriously troubling her. He arranged for his driver to take him to the address mentioned in the letter, telling his staff only that he had a private appointment and would return before dinner. The tea shop was located in a quiet neighborhood he had never visited before, tucked between a used bookstore and a small antique dealer. The area had a bohemian feel that was completely different from the formal surroundings he was accustomed to. Charles felt conspicuous in his tailored suit and polished shoes, but he pressed on, driven by a growing sense of unease about the whole situation. The shop itself was cozy and dimly lit, with mismatched furniture and walls lined with shelves of tea tins from around the world. The air was thick with the scent of Earl Grey and chamomile, creating an atmosphere that should have been comforting, but somehow felt charged with tension. Charles looked around for Camilla, but didn't see her among the handful of patrons scattered throughout the small space. He chose a table in a corner near the back, positioning himself so he could watch the entrance while remaining partially hidden from view. The waitress, a young woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, brought him a pot of English breakfast tea and seemed genuinely pleased to have such a distinguished customer, though she was professional enough not to make a fuss about his identity. Charles waited for nearly an hour, checking his watch repeatedly and growing more concerned with each passing minute. Camilla was never late for anything, a trait he had always admired and occasionally envied. As the afternoon light began to fade outside the shop's small windows, he started to wonder if he had misunderstood the letter somehow, or if something had happened to prevent her from coming. Just as he was considering leaving, the bell above the entrance chimed softly, and Camilla entered the shop. But something was wrong. She moved hesitantly, looking around nervously before spotting him in the corner. Her usual confident stride was replaced by careful, almost fearful steps, and her face bore an expression he had never seen before, a mixture of determination and deep anxiety. She slid into the chair across from him without her usual warm greeting, her hands trembling slightly as she removed her gloves. Charles reached across the table to touch her hand, but she pulled away gently, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. This small gesture sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cooling autumn air. For several moments, they sat in silence while Camilla seemed to gather her thoughts. Charles wanted to ask her what was wrong, to demand an explanation for the mysterious letter and this clandestine meeting, but something in her manner warned him to wait. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and he had to lean forward to hear her clearly. She told him that she had discovered something that would change everything between them and perhaps alter the course of their lives together. Her words were carefully chosen, as if she had rehearsed them many times, but there was an underlying urgency that made Charles's heart race. She spoke of documents she had found, papers that revealed information about her past that she had kept hidden, even from him. Charles felt a growing sense of dread as Camilla's story unfolded. She spoke of a time before they had rekindled their relationship, a period when she had made choices that she now regretted deeply. There had been other relationships, she admitted, but that wasn't the shocking part. What disturbed her so much was the discovery that one of these relationships had produced consequences she had never fully understood until now. The tea in Charles's cup had grown cold as he listened, his mind struggling to process what Camilla was telling him. She spoke of a child, a son she had given birth to decades ago, and given up for adoption, believing at the time that it was the best choice for everyone involved. She had convinced herself that the chapter was closed forever, that the decision she had made would remain a private matter that would never affect anyone else. But, recently, she had been contacted by someone claiming to be that child, now a grown man with children of his own. He had somehow tracked her down and was demanding to meet her, threatening to reveal their connection to the media if she refused. The implications of such a revelation were staggering, not just for Camilla personally, but for the entire royal family. Charles sat in stunned silence as the full weight of her confession settled over him. This wasn't just about a secret from her past. It was about the potential for scandal on a scale that could dwarf anything they had faced before. The media's fascination with royal family secrets was insatiable, and a story like this would dominate headlines for months, possibly years. But, beyond the public relations nightmare, Charles found himself grappling with more personal concerns. How could Camilla have kept such a significant secret from him for so long? They had shared everything, or so he had thought. The revelation that there were parts of her life he knew nothing about felt like a betrayal, even though he understood rationally that everyone had a right to privacy about their past. Camilla seemed to sense his inner turmoil because she reached across the table again, this time successfully taking his hand in hers. Her touch was warm despite the coolness of the shop, and Charles felt some of his initial shock begin to fade, replaced by a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't yet fully identify. She explained that she had never intended to keep this secret forever, but, as time passed, it became increasingly difficult to find the right moment to tell him. During their early relationship, they had been focused on navigating the complexities of royal life and public scrutiny. Later, when their relationship had stabilized and become more serious, she feared that revealing such a significant secret might damage the trust they had built together. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that her attempt to protect their relationship by keeping the secret had now put it at greater risk than if she had simply been honest from the beginning. Charles found himself wondering what other secrets might be lurking in the shadows, what other revelations might be waiting to upend his carefully ordered world. As they sat in the increasingly empty tea shop, With the late afternoon light fading to dusk outside, Charles realized that this conversation would mark a turning point in their relationship. Whatever happened next, they could never go back to the innocent trust they had shared before this moment. The knowledge of Camilla's secret would always be there between them, a reminder that even the closest relationships could harbor hidden depths. The immediate challenge, however, was figuring out how to handle the situation. The man claiming to be Camilla's son had given her 1 week to decide whether to meet with him voluntarily or face the consequences of his going public with his story. Either choice carried enormous risks, but doing nothing wasn't an option. Charles found himself thinking about his own children and the lengths he would go to protect them from unwanted publicity and scandal. If this man truly was Camilla's son, didn't he deserve the chance to know his biological mother? But the timing couldn't have been worse, coming at a moment when the royal family was still recovering from previous controversies and desperately needed a period of stability. As they finally prepared to leave the tea shop, Charles realized that the comfortable predictability of his life had just been shattered. The morning's routine of newspapers and correspondence seemed like something from a distant past, replaced now by urgent questions that had no easy answers. He helped Camilla with her coat, noting how she seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of her secret had been physically crushing her until she finally found the courage to share it. The drive back to Clarence's house was conducted in relative silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what the revelation meant for their future. Charles found himself studying Camilla's profile in the dim light of the car's interior, searching for signs of the woman he thought he knew completely just a few hours earlier. As they pulled into the familiar courtyard of their home, Charles realized that while the building looked exactly the same as when he had left it, everything else had fundamentally changed. The secret Camilla had shared with him wasn't just her burden anymore. It was now theirs to bear together, whatever the consequences might be. The sleepless nights began immediately. Charles found himself lying awake in the early hours, staring at the ornate ceiling of his bedroom while his mind raced with possible scenarios and their consequences. Camilla slept fitfully beside him, occasionally murmuring words he couldn't quite make out, her dreams apparently as troubled as his waking thoughts. 3 days had passed since their meeting at the tea shop, and the weight of the secret seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Charles had tried to maintain his normal schedule, attending meetings and fulfilling his official duties, but his staff had begun to notice his distraction. His private secretary had commented twice on his unusual preoccupation, though he attributed it to the stress of upcoming engagements. The man claiming to be Camilla's son had provided them with a phone number and an email address, along with a deadline that was now just 4 days away. Charles had spent considerable time debating whether they should hire a private investigator to verify the man's claims before taking any further action. The rational part of him insisted that they needed to know the truth before making any decisions, but Camilla seemed convinced that the man was legitimate. Her certainty was based on details he had provided about the circumstances of his birth and adoption, information that she claimed no one else could possibly know. The dates matched her memories perfectly, and he had mentioned a distinctive birthmark that she remembered seeing during the brief time she had held him as a newborn. These personal details had shaken her deeply, confirming what she had hoped might simply be an elaborate hoax. Charles found himself studying Camilla differently now, searching her face for traces of the young woman who had made such a difficult decision all those years ago. He tried to imagine what she must have gone through, facing an unplanned pregnancy at a time when such situations carried enormous social stigma, especially for someone in her position. The courage it must have taken to carry the pregnancy to term and then give the child up for adoption was something he was only beginning to appreciate. The practical implications of the situation were staggering. If the man's identity was confirmed and the story became public, it would inevitably lead to intense media scrutiny of Camilla's entire past. Every relationship, every decision, every moment of her youth would be examined and re-examined by journalists hungry for additional scandalous details. The impact on their marriage and his own reputation would be severe, but Charles found himself more concerned about what Camilla would endure. He had lived his entire life in the public eye and had developed a thick skin when it came to media criticism and intrusion. But Camilla had only entered this world later in life, and while she had adapted remarkably well to the pressures of royal life, this level of personal exposure would be unlike anything she had faced before. The thought of watching her suffer through such an ordeal made Charles's stomach churn with anxiety. During their evening walks in the garden, a tradition they had maintained even during the most stressful periods, Charles broached the subject of seeking professional advice. He suggested contacting their legal team to explore their options and perhaps hiring a crisis management firm to help them navigate the potential fallout. But Camilla remained resistant to involving others, arguing that the more people who knew about the situation, the greater the risk of premature disclosure. Her logic was sound, but Charles worried that they were trying to handle something too complex and dangerous on their own. His years of experience with royal crises had taught him that early preparation was crucial, and waiting until the last minute often led to poor decisions made under extreme pressure. Yet he also understood Camilla's desire to maintain control over such a deeply personal matter for as long as possible. The fourth morning brought an unexpected development. Charles was reviewing the daily briefing papers when his private secretary informed him that a journalist from one of the more aggressive tabloid newspapers had called, asking questions about Camilla's whereabouts on specific dates in the 1970s. The questions were vague enough that they could have been related to any number of stories, but the timing was too suspicious to be coincidental. Charles felt his blood run cold as he realized that the man claiming to be Camilla's son might have already begun his media campaign, testing the waters to see how much the newspapers already knew or suspected. If that was the case, their 4-day deadline might be meaningless. The story could break at any moment, regardless of their decision about whether to meet with him. He immediately called Camilla, who was attending a charity luncheon across London, and asked her to return home as soon as possible. He kept the conversation brief and used coded language they had developed for sensitive situations, but she understood the urgency in his voice. By the time she arrived at Clarence's house 2 hours later, Charles had already begun developing contingency plans for different scenarios. The afternoon was spent in intense discussion about their rapidly narrowing options. Charles argued that they needed to take control of the situation before it spiraled completely out of their hands. He suggested reaching out to the man directly and arranging a private meeting to assess his intentions and perhaps negotiate some kind of agreement. If he was genuinely interested in establishing a relationship with his birth mother, they might be able to find a way to make that happen without public disclosure. But Camilla was skeptical about the man's motives, pointing out that truly wanting to reconnect with family wouldn't typically involve threats and ultimatums. She suspected that his primary goal was financial, either through direct payment for his silence or by selling his story to the highest bidding media outlet. The fact that he had given them such a short deadline suggested that he wasn't interested in a gradual, careful approach to building a relationship. As they debated their options, Charles found himself thinking about his own sons and how he would want them to handle a similar situation if they ever found themselves in comparable circumstances. The parental instinct to protect and guide was strong, but this situation was so far outside normal experience that traditional wisdom seemed inadequate. The evening brought another complication when Charles's eldest son called with news that photographers had been spotted near one of the family's private residences, apparently conducting surveillance and taking long-range photographs. While this wasn't unusual in itself, the timing suggested that someone might be gathering material for a major story. Charles decided not to share his specific concerns with his son, but he did advise increased security precautions for all family members. That night, as Charles and Camilla finally went to bed after hours of circular discussions, they both understood that they were running out of time to make a decision. The man had made it clear that if they didn't respond by his deadline, he would assume they were rejecting his request for a meeting and would proceed with his alternative plan. Neither of them doubted that this alternative involved going public with his story. The next morning brought a brief reprieve when Charles's security team reported that the suspicious photographers had disappeared and there were no signs of ongoing surveillance. But rather than providing relief, this development actually increased their anxiety. If the media interest had suddenly vanished, it might mean that the story was about to break and the surveillance phase was over. Charles spent the morning making discreet inquiries through his network of contacts in the media world, trying to determine if any major story about the royal family was in preparation. The responses he received were mixed. Several editors mentioned hearing rumors about potential revelations involving Camilla, but none had specific details or confirmed publication dates. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing for certain that the story would break. Charles found himself checking news websites obsessively, expecting at any moment to see headlines that would change their lives forever. The stress was beginning to affect his ability to concentrate on his official duties, and he worried that his staff would begin asking direct questions about his distraction. Camilla seemed to be handling the pressure better, at least outwardly. She maintained her regular schedule of engagements and continued to fulfill her public duties with her characteristic grace and professionalism. But Charles knew her well enough to recognize the signs of internal strain, the slight tightness around her eyes, the way she held her shoulders just a bit higher than usual, the occasional moment of distraction during conversations. During lunch, they received an unexpected visitor. Charles's private secretary announced that a woman was at the main entrance, asking to speak with Camilla about a personal matter. She wouldn't provide her name or explain the nature of her business, but she insisted that it was urgent and related to recent communications Camilla had received. Charles's first instinct was to have security remove the woman immediately, but something about the description gave him pause. The woman was described as being in her 70s, well-dressed but clearly nervous, and she carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to proper society. These details didn't match the profile they had developed of the man claiming to be Camilla's son, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. After a brief consultation, Charles and Camilla decided to meet with the woman in his private study, with security personnel stationed discreetly nearby. They needed to know if this visit was connected to their current crisis, and the only way to find out was to hear what she had to say. The woman who entered the study was indeed elderly and refined, with silver hair styled in a classic manner and clothing that suggested both good taste and financial comfort. She introduced herself as Margaret Thompson and explained that she had come to London specifically to see Camilla, having traveled from her home in the countryside after receiving some disturbing news. Margaret's story was both shocking and illuminating. She revealed that she was the adoptive mother of the man who had been contacting Camilla, and she had only recently learned about his attempts to establish contact. According to Margaret, her son had always known he was adopted, and she had been supportive of his desire to learn about his birth parents when he expressed interest as an adult. But what she described was very different from a simple desire to connect with his biological mother. Margaret painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly bitter and resentful as he learned more about Camilla's life and status. Rather than feeling grateful for the opportunities his adoption had provided, he had begun to view himself as a victim who had been denied his rightful place in society. Margaret's son had apparently spent years researching Camilla's background and had become obsessed with what he saw as the unfairness of his situation. He believed that if Camilla had kept him, he would have grown up with privileges and opportunities that his middle-class upbringing had denied him. This resentment had gradually transformed into a desire for what he considered to be compensation for what he had lost. The elderly woman was clearly distressed by her son's behavior and had come to warn Camilla about his intentions. She had tried to reason with him, explaining that his adoption had been an act of love and that his birth mother had undoubtedly made the best decision she could under difficult circumstances. But her arguments had fallen on deaf ears, and she feared that he was now beyond reasoning. Charles listened to Margaret's account with growing concern. This was worse than they had imagined. They weren't dealing with someone who simply wanted to establish a relationship or even someone who was primarily motivated by financial gain. They were facing a person driven by deep-seated resentment and a sense of entitlement that could make him unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Margaret provided them with additional information about her son's current situation. He had recently lost his job and was facing financial difficulties, which had intensified his bitterness about his circumstances. She believed that his current plan involved not just revealing his identity to the media, but also claiming that Camilla had abandoned him without consideration for his welfare and that the royal family owed him compensation for years of denial and neglect. The meeting with Margaret lasted nearly 2 hours, during which she provided Charles and Camilla with a much clearer picture of what they were facing. Her son had apparently been planning this confrontation for months, carefully researching the best ways to generate maximum media attention and public sympathy for his situation. He had even consulted with lawyers about potential legal claims, though Margaret wasn't sure whether any legitimate case could be made. As Margaret prepared to leave, she expressed her profound apologies for her son's behavior and assured them that she would continue trying to convince him to abandon his current course of action. But she also warned them that she had very little influence over him anymore, and that they should prepare for the worst-case scenario. Charles walked Margaret to her car personally, touched by her courage in coming forward and grateful for the warning she had provided. As he watched her drive away, he realized that their situation had become even more complex than they had imagined. They weren't just dealing with potential embarrassment or scandal. They were facing someone who might be genuinely unstable and whose actions could be impossible to predict or control. The deadline was now less than 24 hours away, and Charles felt the weight of impending crisis pressing down on him like a physical force. Margaret Thompson's warning had transformed what they had hoped might be a manageable situation into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The image of Camilla's biological son as simply someone seeking connection or even money had been replaced by the reality of a deeply resentful man with an agenda that could destroy everything they had built together. Charles had barely slept, spending most of the night pacing his study and considering their increasingly limited options. By dawn, he had made a difficult decision. They needed professional help, regardless of Camilla's concerns about expanding the circle of people who knew their secret. The risks of handling this alone now clearly outweighed the benefits of maintaining privacy. His first call was to Sir Jonathan Myers, a former intelligence officer who now provided discreet crisis management services to high-profile clients. Jonathan had helped navigate several royal family situations over the years and could be trusted to handle sensitive matters with absolute confidentiality. Charles explained the situation in broad terms and asked him to come to Clarence House immediately. While waiting for Jonathan to arrive, Charles and Camilla sat in the morning room, picking at breakfast neither of them could taste. The normal routine of reviewing newspapers had been abandoned. Neither wanted to see what stories were already circulating or wonder if today would be the day their private crisis became public knowledge. Camilla had been unusually quiet since Margaret's visit, as if hearing about her son's bitterness and resentment from an outside perspective had finally made the situation feel real to her. Charles could see the guilt weighing on her, the questioning of choices she had made decades earlier with the best intentions she could manage at the time. He reached across the table and took her hand, struck by how cold her fingers felt despite the warmth of the room. "None of this is your fault," he said quietly, words they had exchanged several times over the past few days, but that seemed to need constant repetition. "You made the best decision you could with the information and circumstances you had at the time." Camilla nodded, but Charles could see she wasn't entirely convinced. The natural tendency to second-guess past decisions was something he understood well, having spent countless hours over the years wondering if different choices might have led to better outcomes for everyone involved. But dwelling on what couldn't be changed was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. Jonathan Myers arrived just after 9 o'clock, bringing with him an air of calm competence that was immediately reassuring. He was a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s who had spent his career dealing with crises that most people couldn't even imagine. His presence in the room somehow made their situation feel more manageable, even though the facts hadn't changed. Charles and Camilla spent the next hour providing Jonathan with every detail they could remember about their contact with Camilla's son and Margaret's warning about his true intentions. Jonathan listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook, his expression remaining neutral throughout their account. When they finished, Jonathan was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing everything he had heard. Finally, he looked up from his notes and delivered his assessment with characteristic directness. Their situation was indeed serious, but it wasn't hopeless. There were still moves they could make to minimize the damage, but they would need to act quickly and decisively. Jonathan's first recommendation was immediate consultation with their legal team to understand exactly what claims, if any, Camilla's son might be able to make. While he couldn't force them to acknowledge him or have a relationship with him, there might be legal avenues he could pursue that would keep the story in the public eye for extended periods. Understanding these potential vulnerabilities was crucial to developing an effective strategy. His second suggestion was more controversial. Rather than waiting for Camilla's son to act, they should consider taking control of the narrative by releasing their own statement acknowledging the situation on their terms. This would allow them to frame the story in a way that emphasized Camilla's difficult circumstances at the time and the loving choice she made to ensure her child had the best possible opportunities. Charles found this idea intriguing, but Camilla was immediately resistant. The thought of voluntarily exposing herself to public scrutiny and judgment was terrifying, especially given the likely media frenzy that would follow any admission. Jonathan acknowledged her concerns, but pointed out that their alternatives were becoming increasingly limited. The discussion was interrupted by a call from Charles's private secretary. A package had been delivered by courier, addressed to Camilla with instructions that it was to be given to her personally and immediately. The secretary's tone suggested that he found the delivery unusual, though he couldn't specify exactly why. The package was small and professionally wrapped, with no return address or identifying marks except for Camilla's name written in block letters. Inside, they found a USB drive and a brief typed note explaining that the drive contained evidence that would be released to the media if Camilla didn't respond to her son's request by the deadline. The note was unsigned but ended with a phone number they recognized from their previous communications. Jonathan immediately took charge of the USB drive, explaining that they needed to examine its contents but should do so on a secure computer that wasn't connected to any networks. He produced a laptop from his briefcase, one that he used specifically for this type of sensitive material, and connected the drive while Charles and Camilla watched anxiously. What they saw on the screen made Charles's heart sink. The drive contained dozens of documents and photographs, some dating back decades, that chronicled Camilla's life in extraordinary detail. There were copies of medical records from the hospital where she had given birth, documentation from the adoption agency, and even photographs that appeared to have been taken during her pregnancy. More disturbing were the recent materials, photographs of Camilla and Charles at various private events, detailed notes about their daily routines and habits, and what appeared to be transcripts of private conversations that could only have been obtained through electronic surveillance. The scope and detail of the information suggested that they had been under observation for months, possibly longer. Jonathan's expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed the contents of the drive. This wasn't just about someone wanting to establish contact with his birth mother. This was the work of someone who had been conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation. The level of preparation and the resources that would have been required to gather this information suggested that Camilla's son either had significant financial backing or professional help. The implications were staggering. If this material was released to the media, it wouldn't just be a story about Camilla's secret. It would expose details about their private lives that had never been intended for public consumption. The photographs and transcripts would provide fodder for months of sensationalized coverage, turning their personal relationship into a public spectacle. Charles found himself struggling with a mixture of anger and fear that was unlike anything he had experienced before. The invasion of their privacy was bad enough, but the realization that they had been living under surveillance without knowing it made him feel violated in ways he hadn't known were possible. Every private moment, every intimate conversation, had potentially been monitored and recorded. Camilla seemed to be in a state of shock as she stared at images of herself that she had no memory of being taken. Some appeared to be from events they had attended together, but others seemed to have been captured during her private moments, possibly through long-range photography or hidden cameras. The violation of her privacy was complete and devastating. Jonathan spent several more minutes reviewing the material before delivering his updated assessment. The situation had moved beyond crisis management into the realm of potential blackmail and criminal activity. The level of surveillance and documentation suggested that this wasn't the work of one disturbed individual. Someone with significant resources and professional capabilities was involved. His recommendation was immediate contact with law enforcement, specifically units that specialized in stalking and privacy violations. While this would mean expanding the circle of people who knew about their situation, the criminal nature of the surveillance made it essential to involve the authorities. They could also explore legal injunctions to prevent publication of the illegally obtained material. Charles weighed Jonathan's advice carefully. Involving law enforcement would certainly escalate the situation and make it more difficult to keep the story private. But the evidence on the USB drive made it clear that privacy was probably no longer an option. Their choice now was between being victims of someone else's actions or taking steps to protect themselves and potentially prevent similar attacks on other members of the royal family. The decision was made more urgent by another call from Charles's private secretary. Representatives from 3 different newspapers had contacted his office within the past hour, all asking questions about Camilla's past and requesting statements about recent allegations. The media feeding frenzy was clearly beginning, even though no story had been officially published yet. Charles made the decision to contact law enforcement immediately. He called the head of royal protection, who arranged for detectives from the Metropolitan Police's specialist units to come to Clarence House within the hour. Meanwhile, Jonathan began working on legal strategies to minimize the damage if the story did become public. The detectives who arrived were experienced in handling high-profile cases involving stalking and privacy violations. They took possession of the USB drive and began the process of tracing its origins, while also arranging for enhanced security measures around Charles and Camilla's residences and usual locations. The lead detective, Inspector Sarah Crawford, explained that cases involving this level of surveillance often had multiple perpetrators and sophisticated organization behind them. The quality of the photographs and the detail of the personal information suggested professional-grade equipment and techniques that went far beyond what a single individual could typically manage. As the afternoon progressed, the investigation began to reveal the scope of what they were facing. The surveillance wasn't limited to Charles and Camilla. There was evidence that other family members had also been monitored, though apparently not to the same extent. The operation appeared to have been ongoing for at least 6 months, possibly longer. Inspector Crawford explained that this type of systematic surveillance often preceded attempts at blackmail or extortion, which meant that Camilla's son might not be acting alone. There could be others involved who saw the royal family's desire to avoid scandal as an opportunity for financial gain. The personal nature of Camilla's secret made it particularly valuable as leverage. The evening brought both good news and bad news. The good news was that the legal team had succeeded in obtaining a temporary injunction preventing publication of the material on the USB drive, at least until the courts could determine whether it had been obtained illegally. The bad news was that Charles's son had called to report being approached by a journalist asking detailed questions about family secrets. It was becoming clear that the story was spreading through media circles even without official publication. Jonathan explained that this was common in high-profile cases. Rumors and speculation often circulated widely among journalists and editors before any outlet was willing to commit to publishing unverified claims. But the fact that the story was now being actively investigated by multiple news organizations meant that publication was probably inevitable. As Charles and Camilla prepared for what might be their last night of privacy before the story broke, they both understood that their lives were about to change dramatically. The comfortable routine they had enjoyed was about to be shattered, replaced by the chaos and scrutiny that accompanied major royal scandals. But they also realized that they were no longer facing this crisis alone. They had professional help, legal protection, and law enforcement support. Whatever happened next, they would meet it together with the best possible preparation and defense. The secret that had started this entire ordeal was no longer theirs alone to bear. The deadline had passed, but the expected explosion of media coverage hadn't materialized. Charles woke to a strangely normal morning, with his usual newspapers delivered and no urgent calls from his communications team. The anticlimactic nature of the moment was almost more unsettling than if the story had broken as expected. Not knowing when the other shoe would drop was proving to be its own form of torture. Inspector Crawford arrived early with an update that partially explained the delay. Their investigation had uncovered evidence that Camilla's son, whose real name was David Martin, was not the mastermind behind the surveillance operation. He appeared to be working with or being manipulated by a more sophisticated group that specialized in gathering compromising information about public figures for financial gain. The detective explained that David Martin had significant gambling debts and had apparently been recruited by this group several months earlier. They had offered to pay off his debts and provide him with additional compensation in exchange for his cooperation in targeting his birth mother. What had started as his personal quest for recognition and possibly revenge had evolved into something much more calculated and professional. This revelation cast the entire situation in a different light. Rather than dealing with an unstable individual acting on his own emotional impulses, they were facing an organized operation that viewed the royal family as a business opportunity. These groups often had multiple targets and sophisticated methods for gathering and leveraging sensitive information. Inspector Crawford's team had been working through the night to trace the origins of the surveillance equipment and identify other members of the group. They had discovered that similar operations were being conducted against several other high-profile families, including politicians, celebrities, and business leaders. The scope of the criminal enterprise was far larger than initially suspected. The investigation had also revealed why the expected media coverage hadn't appeared on schedule. The group's lawyers had advised them that publishing the material while it was subject to legal injunctions could result in serious criminal charges. Instead, they were apparently working on alternative strategies that would allow them to profit from their information while minimizing their legal exposure. Charles found this information both reassuring and terrifying. On one hand, it meant that the immediate threat of publication had been reduced. On the other hand, it suggested that they were dealing with criminals who were sophisticated enough to have legal counsel and long-term strategies. This wasn't going to be resolved quickly or easily. Camilla took the news with characteristic composure, though Charles could see the strain in her face. The knowledge that she had been specifically targeted and manipulated was deeply troubling, but she seemed relieved to learn that her son was as much a victim as a perpetrator. The maternal instincts that had never fully disappeared despite the decades of separation made her worry about David's situation even while understanding the threat he posed. The morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Margaret Thompson, David's adoptive mother, who arrived unannounced and in obvious distress. She had spent the previous day trying to locate her son after learning about his involvement with what she now understood to be a criminal organization. Her attempts to reach him had been unsuccessful, and she feared for his safety. Margaret's account of recent events provided additional insight into how the group had manipulated David. They had apparently approached him several months earlier, claiming to be private investigators who specialized in helping adopted children reconnect with their birth families. They had offered their services for free, presenting themselves as philanthropists who wanted to reunite families separated by unfortunate circumstances. Only gradually had David realized that their true goal was gathering information that could be used for blackmail. By then, however, he was already deeply in debt to them and had provided access to information and assistance that made him a criminal accomplice. Margaret believed that he was now trapped in a situation he couldn't escape and was probably too frightened to seek help from authorities. Charles found himself in the unexpected position of feeling sympathy for someone who had been threatening his family just days earlier. The picture Margaret painted was of a man who had been systematically manipulated and exploited by people who understood exactly how to prey on his emotional vulnerabilities and financial desperation. Inspector Crawford's team was now working to locate David Martin, both to ensure his safety and to gather additional information about the criminal group. They had traced several of the financial transactions and identified at least 3 other individuals who appeared to be involved in the operation. The investigation was expanding rapidly as they uncovered connections to similar activities targeting other prominent families. The legal team had also made progress, obtaining expanded injunctions that covered not just the specific material on the USB drive, but any information obtained through illegal surveillance. They were also exploring civil litigation against the group for invasion of privacy and harassment, which could potentially result in significant financial damages. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Jonathan Myers received a call from a journalist at one of the major newspapers who wanted to discuss a story his paper was considering. Rather than being about Camilla's secret, the story focused on the criminal group that had been targeting multiple high-profile families with surveillance and blackmail schemes. The journalist, who had been investigating similar operations for several months, had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated network that operated across multiple countries and had been active for several years. He was seeking comment from potential victims, including Charles and Camilla, for an expose that would focus on the criminal enterprise rather than the personal information they had gathered. This presented an interesting opportunity. Rather than being passive victims waiting for their private information to be revealed, they could potentially become part of a larger story about criminal activity targeting public figures. This would allow them to acknowledge Camilla's situation while framing it within the context of criminal victimization rather than personal scandal. Jonathan arranged a meeting with the journalist, a respected investigative reporter named Sarah Mitchell, who had won several awards for her coverage of organized crime. Sarah explained that her investigation had uncovered evidence of similar operations in at least 6 countries, with victims including government ministers, entertainment figures, and business leaders. The group's methods were sophisticated and carefully planned. They would identify potential targets based on their wealth, public profile, and likelihood of paying to keep embarrassing information private. They would then spend months gathering information through surveillance, hacking, and infiltration before approaching their targets with demands for payment. What made Charles and Camilla's case unusual was the personal connection through David Martin. Most of the group's operations relied entirely on external surveillance and hacking. Having someone with family connections to provide access and information was relatively rare and had allowed them to gather more intimate and potentially damaging material than was typical. Sarah's story would expose the group's methods and identify many of their targets, which would likely lead to additional law enforcement investigations and prosecutions. It would also provide context for Camilla's situation that emphasized her role as a victim rather than someone with something to hide. Charles and Camilla spent several hours discussing whether to cooperate with Sarah's investigation. The decision to go public with their story, even in this context, was not one they could make lightly. Once their situation was part of a published article, they would lose all control over how the information was used and interpreted. But the alternative appeared to be waiting indefinitely for the criminal group to find a way to profit from their information while living under constant threat of exposure. Working with Sarah would at least allow them to have some input into how their story was told and ensure that it was presented fairly and accurately. The decision was made easier by Inspector Crawford's assessment that cooperation with the media investigation could actually strengthen the criminal case against the group. The publicity would likely encourage other victims to come forward and provide additional evidence for prosecution. It would also make it much more difficult for the group to continue operating, as their methods would be widely known and their targets would be alert to potential surveillance. Late in the afternoon, Charles and Camilla agreed to participate in Sarah's investigation. They would provide a statement acknowledging Camilla's past and confirming that they had been targeted by the criminal group, while emphasizing that they were cooperating with law enforcement to ensure that the perpetrators were prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The statement was carefully crafted to be factual and straightforward without providing unnecessary details that could be sensationalized. It acknowledged that Camilla had given birth to a child in her youth and placed him for adoption, that this information had been obtained through illegal surveillance, and that they were working with authorities to ensure justice for all victims of the criminal enterprise. As evening approached, Charles reflected on how dramatically their situation had changed in just a few days. What had begun as a personal crisis involving Camilla's secret had evolved into their participation in exposing a criminal organization that had been victimizing numerous families. Rather than being helpless victims, they had found a way to take some control over their circumstances. The story would be published in 2 days, giving them time to prepare for the inevitable media attention and public reaction. Their communications team was already developing strategies for handling the follow-up coverage and managing their public engagements during the period of intense interest that would follow publication. But, perhaps most importantly, Charles and Camilla had found a way to face this crisis together, with professional support and a clear plan for moving forward. The secret that had threatened to destroy their relationship had instead become something they could address honestly and directly, while also helping to protect other families from similar victimization. As they prepared for what would undoubtedly be a challenging period ahead, Charles felt a sense of relief that the waiting and uncertainty were finally coming to an end. Whatever happened next, they would meet it with their eyes open and their defenses prepared. The crisis that had seemed insurmountable just days earlier was becoming something they could manage and ultimately overcome. The morning of publication arrived with an unusual calm that reminded Charles of the eerie stillness that often preceded major storms. He and Camilla had risen early, sharing a quiet breakfast while their communications team made final preparations for what they knew would be an intense day of media attention and public scrutiny. Sarah Mitchell's article appeared simultaneously in print and online, with the headline, "Criminal Network Targets Prominent Families with Surveillance and Blackmail Schemes." Camilla's story was featured prominently, but presented within the larger context of criminal victimization, exactly as they had hoped. The article was thorough, well-researched, and treated all the victims with dignity and respect. Reading the published account of their ordeal was a surreal experience for Charles. Seeing their private crisis transformed into a news story somehow made it feel more manageable, as if the act of public acknowledgement had reduced its power to cause them pain. The article's focus on the criminal enterprise rather than personal scandal helped frame their situation in a way that emphasized their resilience rather than their vulnerability. The initial public reaction was largely sympathetic, with many comments expressing outrage at the invasion of privacy and support for the victims who had chosen to speak out. The story generated significant interest from law enforcement agencies in other countries, who reported similar operations and expressed interest in coordinating their investigations. By mid-morning, Inspector Crawford arrived with news that the publicity had already produced concrete results. 3 more victims of the criminal group had contacted police with additional information, and international authorities had made 2 arrests in connection with related operations. The decision to go public was proving to be strategically sound from a law enforcement perspective. More personally significant was a call that came just before noon. David Martin, Camilla's son, had contacted his adoptive mother Margaret and asked her to arrange a meeting with Camilla. He had seen the article and, finally, understood the extent to which he had been manipulated by the criminal group. He wanted to apologize and try to rebuild some kind of relationship with his birth mother, if she was willing. The request put Camilla in an emotionally complex position. On one hand, her maternal instincts had never fully disappeared, and she had worried about David's safety and well-being even while dealing with the threat he had posed. On the other hand, the trauma of the past week and the violation of her privacy made the thought of meeting him both appealing and terrifying. Charles found himself surprised by his own reaction to David's request. Rather than feeling protective anger towards someone who had threatened their family, he felt something closer to compassion for a man who had clearly been exploited by people far more sophisticated and ruthless than himself. The distinction between David as a threat and David as a victim had become increasingly clear as more information emerged about the criminal operation. After extensive discussion and consultation with both their security team and counselors experienced in family reunion situations, they agreed to a carefully arranged meeting. It would take place at a neutral location with security present, and both parties would have support personnel available. The goal was to allow for honest communication while ensuring everyone's safety and emotional well-being. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, giving everyone time to process the emotional intensity of recent events and prepare for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. In the meantime, Charles and Camilla focused on managing the ongoing media attention and continuing their cooperation with law enforcement investigations. The public reaction to the story continued to be largely supportive, with many people expressing admiration for their courage and speaking out about their victimization. Several other high-profile families came forward with similar experiences, creating a sense of solidarity among victims that helped reduce the isolation and shame that often accompanied such violations of privacy. Charles was particularly struck by the number of people who shared their own stories of difficult family situations and the choices they had made under challenging circumstances. Camilla's decision to place her child for adoption resonated with many people who had faced similar dilemmas, and the public understanding seemed deeper and more nuanced than they had expected. The legal proceedings against the criminal group were progressing rapidly, with additional charges being filed as investigators uncovered more evidence of their activities. The group's sophisticated methods and international scope made it a high-priority case for multiple law enforcement agencies, ensuring that significant resources would be devoted to prosecution. Jonathan Myers reported that the civil litigation was also proceeding well, with strong evidence of privacy violations and harassment that would likely result in substantial damages. More importantly, the legal actions were serving as a deterrent to other groups that might consider similar operations, as the high-profile nature of the case made it clear that such activities would face serious consequences. As the week progressed, Charles noticed a gradual shift in his own emotional state. The intense anxiety and fear that had dominated his thoughts since receiving Camilla's mysterious letter was slowly being replaced by something closer to relief and even gratitude. The crisis had forced them to confront difficult truths and make challenging decisions, but it had also demonstrated their ability to handle adversity together. Camilla seemed to be experiencing a similar transformation. The guilt and shame that had initially overwhelmed her when the secret was revealed had gradually given way to a sense of empowerment and purpose. Her willingness to speak out had helped expose a criminal enterprise and potentially protected other families from similar victimization. The choice she had seen as her greatest failure had become an opportunity to help others. The day before the scheduled meeting with David, Margaret Thompson visited Clarence's house to provide an update on her son's condition and to help prepare for what would undoubtedly be an emotionally charged encounter. She reported that David was genuinely remorseful about his actions and seemed to understand the extent to which he had been manipulated by the criminal group. Margaret also provided more context about David's life and personality, helping Camilla prepare for meeting the man her infant son had become. He was reportedly intelligent and well-educated, with a career in technology that had been successful until his gambling problems led to the financial difficulties that made him vulnerable to recruitment by the criminal group. The meeting took place at a private residence belonging to mutual friends of Jonathan Myers, a location that provided both security and a comfortable, non-threatening environment. Charles and Camilla arrived first, accompanied by security personnel and a counselor experienced in family reunification situations. David Martin arrived with Margaret and his own counselor, appearing nervous but determined. He was a man in his early 40s who bore a striking resemblance to Camilla, particularly around the eyes and in his facial expressions. The family connection was immediately apparent, making the meeting feel both natural and deeply emotional. The initial conversation was awkward and tentative, with both David and Camilla struggling to find appropriate words for such an unprecedented situation. But, gradually, as they shared basic information about their lives and experiences, a tentative connection began to emerge. David's apologies seemed genuine, and his understanding of how he had been manipulated appeared complete. Camilla found herself studying David's face and mannerisms, searching for traces of the infant she had held briefly decades earlier. The maternal bond she had tried to suppress was still there, complicated by years of separation and recent trauma, but undeniably real. The conversation gradually shifted from apologies and explanations to genuine interest in each other's lives and experiences. Charles observed the interaction with fascination and growing respect for both participants. The courage required for both of them to participate in this meeting was enormous, and their willingness to move beyond the immediate crisis towards something potentially positive was admirable. As the meeting progressed, they began discussing the possibility of maintaining some form of ongoing relationship. David expressed interest in being part of Camilla's life in whatever way she felt comfortable, while acknowledging that he had forfeited any right to make demands or expectations. Camilla, meanwhile, seemed to be rediscovering maternal feelings she had buried for decades. The meeting lasted several hours and ended with tentative plans for future contact. They would start slowly, with occasional phone calls and perhaps additional meetings as everyone became more comfortable with the situation. There was no attempt to recreate the parent-child relationship they had never had, but there was a genuine foundation for some form of family connection. As Charles and Camilla drove home that evening, they both reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed by the events of the past 2 weeks. What had begun as a terrifying threat to their privacy and relationship had evolved into an opportunity for healing and growth that neither of them could have imagined. The criminal case continued to develop, with additional arrests and evidence suggesting that the prosecution would be successful. The public attention gradually shifted to other stories, allowing Charles and Camilla to resume something approaching their normal routine while maintaining their new relationship with David. 6 months later, as Charles walked through the same garden where he had first felt the unease that led to this entire ordeal, he marveled at how much had changed. Camilla's secret was no longer a source of shame, but a part of their shared history that had ultimately strengthened their relationship. David had become a regular, if still tentative, presence in their lives, bringing joy and complexity in equal measure. The criminal group that had threatened their family was facing prosecution in multiple countries, with their methods exposed and their operations disrupted. Other families had been spared similar victimization, and new laws were being developed to better protect privacy and prevent such sophisticated criminal enterprises. Most importantly, Charles and Camilla had discovered that they were stronger together than they had ever imagined. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their relationship had instead revealed its true foundation, not just love and attraction, but genuine partnership and mutual support that could weather any storm. As he reached the spot where he had first noticed Camilla's unusual behavior weeks earlier, Charles smiled at the irony. The secret she had been so afraid to reveal had ultimately brought them closer together and given them an opportunity to help others. Sometimes, he reflected, the things we fear most about ourselves turn out to be the very things that lead to our greatest growth and contribution to the world.